Good evening. It's great to see everyone out on this beautiful Sunday night. Cold. I'm not sure I can truly explain to you what it's like to not be from here. To appreciate the everyday. I went to work in the snow the other day. That's a new one for me. I didn't know people did that. It's fascinating, but I'm getting used to it slowly. I'm finding out that having extra weight and my wife being a fantastic cook works in the winter here. That's a good thing. I'm finding out that it's also why some of the other men here keep beards. I do it obviously because it doesn't get any better looking than this. So that was my reason. Y'all are just here because it's cold at times. But I am grateful to be here. I don't know if you saw this recently, but there was a fantastic moment of great theological debate that happened just a few weeks ago, and it was all brought about by a TV show called Jeopardy. Did anybody catch this? Fantastic moment where the final Jeopardy question was, what epistle of Paul had or holds the most references to the Old Testament? Now, for any great Bible scholar out there, you might look at that and go, okay, I'll think about this for a minute. Paul did write about 60% of the New Testament. He did like to write things. I would have to say the book of Romans, not Jeopardy. They said the book of Hebrews. Ooh, right? Yeah. It's like suddenly the debate of the century. Who wrote Hebrews? And Jeopardy's like, we know. It was Paul. So when I got to the book of Hebrews and we had this verse for this evening and for what we're going to be studying, this concept of copies and shadows, I remember instantly harking back to that and going, well, I'm not making that mistake. I will never get up in front of everyone and say, well, when Paul wrote Hebrews, I would never make such a mistake ever, right? Nobody's ever done that before. But actually, I found myself having done that historically. I'm going to do my best tonight. I do not believe Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. I'm in the camp, I believe it was actually Barnabas. That's me. And the main reason is because he sounds a lot like Paul, but there's enough differences to where it's not. So it sounds like somebody who spent a lot of time with Paul, which is where you would get a lot of the connections with Barnabas, but he has a lot of other things that he adds to it. The book of Hebrews is a fantastic book, and it does hearken back constantly to the Old Testament, to the old law, to the priesthood, to all of those different things. And so that's our invitation tonight to dive into it. But one of the things about Hebrews that we have to be careful about is that the New Testament, and especially when you look at this fact that we often look at the Bible as New Testament and Old Testament, and we miss some context together. In fact, I would make the argument, and this is an analogy that's not original to me, it's one that I've heard used through the years, is that the Old Testament and the New Testament can't be used separately. They just fall flat when they're separate. Because so much of what is said in books like Hebrews and Romans and others harkens back to the old law and to the way things were and the prophecies of things to come. In fact, the Gospels constantly point back to the things that were to come. There's this constant connection. And the best analogy I know is someone who said it's actually like a play, Act 1 and Act 2. If you show up at intermission and you go in to Act 2 without knowing Act 1, you're going to be very lost. Because you're not going to catch a lot of the references and the realization of what's happening and the connections of the stories and the threads that connect it all together. If you only see Act 1, though, when you leave at intermission and go elsewhere, guess what? You don't know the rest of the story. You don't know what happens. You're left awaiting something that is to come, but it's not there yet. And so you're sitting there lost in between. But if you should stay for the full play, if you were to watch the whole entire thing, a beautiful narrative is woven from the Old Testament to the New. Over 1,500 years of history is slowly shown to see something that is to come. And then it arrives. And when it arrives, great things change, and everything going forward changes from that. It's a beautiful way of seeing Scripture and understanding it and seeing, okay, so I can't just dismiss the Old Testament because it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus, because then I'm not understanding that most of the New Testament is constantly pointing to the Old Testament of this is the one we were waiting for. This is he, the one who was coming. And so to separate the two is to miss the context. It's to miss the totality of the story of Jesus from the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. fact, I hear a lot of students at times will say, all I need is Jesus. And I want to go, yes, but there's more to the story than just that. Because if you're saying just the man, then you're missing Jesus, God, creator, the beginning. Well, I don't need any of the church and all the rest of that stuff. I don't need that. This is my favorite thing. I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. Have you heard that recently? That's one of my new favorite things. That's like saying, I'm fat, I'm just overweight. You can't separate those two. They are one and the same. You're missing the context if you don't realize the totality of it all. When we were looking at this series, and Greg and I were having discussions, and Clay and Landon and I were working through this concept of not just the kingdom on Sunday mornings, but this concept of the shadow, to live in the shadow of copies and the things that were to come and the prophecies that set forth the coming of Jesus, which is what we're going to be doing on Sunday nights for through this quarter, these 13 weeks. I don't want us to miss the big picture. Tonight, as was read from us in Hebrews, and I hope you'll turn there in Hebrews chapter 8 is where we'll be. And I don't want you to miss the beauty of what is happening in this moment. Now, when it starts in chapter 8, it starts off by saying this. Now, the point in what we are saying is this. Now, anytime a chapter starts with that, you go back, right? Because what are you going to be missing? The context of what's being said. He's going, now, this is the reason why I just said what I said. So everything is prior to that. So we're going to go back and look at chapter 7 here in a second. What I want to note this is, growing up in Europe, I had a blessing as a child of being dragged all over the world to see things. Now, if you've studied art or art history, you will realize that there's a lot of art in Europe. I don't know if you've caught on to this. They have a lot of art. It's everywhere. Now, I am not one of those believers that art is, or that beauty is solely in the eye of the beholder. In fact, I think that is so become misused in so many ways, because there's a lot of things I look at that they go, it's beautiful, and I'm like, no, it's not. That's a pile of trash. And they go, but it's beautiful in its own contextual way. And I'm like, no, it's not. That's trash. That's not the same thing. So I'm not one of those who believes all art is subjective and the rest. Instead, I can look at things and go, that is stunning. That is beautiful. I remember the first time when I could truly appreciate it as a child, when my father took me to St. Peter's in Rome. If you've never stood at St. Peter's, it's the largest cathedral in the world. You can fit the entire Pyramid of Giza inside of it. It's stunningly marvelous. They claim it's the house of God. I argue even God's house is better than that one. It's just not even close. But standing in there, there's this beautiful statue that was carved by a young man by the name of Michelangelo Buonarroti. You might call him Michelangelo, like one of the Ninja Turtles. But Michelangelo has this statue called the Pietà. And the Pietà is the mother, Mary, holding her lifeless son's body. And it's a fascinating piece because Jesus in it is 33 years old, but the mother looks like she's 16. And his ability to carve images out of stone is just stunning. You can see the sinews of their hands carved in marble. You can see impressions where the hands are pressing in on the marble itself, and you go, how? And Michelangelo was known, in fact, for saying, oh, I just released the image from the rock that God placed within it. I love that. Oh, I just took off the outer shell. That's what God already had put inside that piece of marble. And I remember standing in front of it and just being in awe that anyone could do that. Stunningly beautiful. I stood in the Sistine Chapel looking up, and it's a room, honestly, about the size of this, maybe a little bit smaller, looking up at a ceiling, a punishment. If you don't know the story, Michelangelo was made to paint a ceiling. No one painted ceilings in that day. It was a punishment by Pope Julius II. Thanks, Dad. That's all of my history lessons right there, that I remember who that is. Made him paint a ceiling because he would not finish this. He had run away from Rome, and in fact, he made him come back and said, you will paint the ceiling. And out of pure rebellion said, I will make it the greatest ceiling that anybody's ever come to. No one will remember your name. Everyone will remember mine. And he did. For 4 years of his life, he stood upside down, hanging basically, painting on a ceiling. He would get angry when there was pieces he didn't like. He would tear off 6 months worth of work and throw it down on the ground. But when you walk in there today, nobody remembers the Pope's name, except for me because of my dad. But the beauty that you see, you understand. And I'll tell you what, if you've ever stood in front of the Mona Lisa at the Louvre, you realize how tiny that painting is. It's like that big. And every time you see it, you're like, it's stunning, it's beautiful. And part of you wants to go, it's not necessarily the beauty of it, it's the allure. It's the, is she smiling? What is she smiling about? What is going on? What's happening? It's those types of things. But I'll tell you what's different is if I were to put an image tonight on this screen behind us and said, this is the Sistine Chapel, and this is the Pietà, and this is the Mona Lisa, you wouldn't have experienced it. You wouldn't have known what it smells like inside of the Sistine Chapel. You wouldn't have felt the coolness of the marble that comes off from inside of St. Peter's. You wouldn't have experienced the crowds of the Louvre, the people pressing against. You would not have experienced it because it would have been just a copy, not the real thing. Just a copy in the moment of the real thing. Some of you may have realized that there is an actual World Cup going on right now. I don't know if America does that, but I do. And I've enjoyed watching the games over the last couple of weeks. It's being held in Qatar right now, but it's the first time in its history that it's been held during the winter, mainly because you can't hold anything in the summer in Qatar because it's like 140 degrees. And so they're doing it in the wintertime. And I remember as I was sitting there thinking back on the original moments of my life, childhood, in 1990, Italy hosted the World Cup, and I was there as a child, and my father took me to the game to see USA, Italy. I was 7 years old. I still remember Giannini scored 1-0, Italy win. I remember the crowds, and I remember the feeling of it all, and it was just an unbelievable thing. It's what reignited and ignited in me a passion for soccer because of the experience I had with my father. It's something that still resonates with me today. But if I were to watch a game like I have been this week, is it the same? It's not. It's just a copy of what it is to experience the real thing. The real thing. You see, this verse from Hebrews, it talks about copies and shadows. Now, for a while, I went back and forth and I said, is the intent of the author to make these almost the same thing? And the reality is no. I don't believe he is. What I believe he's doing is he's talking about the copies, that all that was happening with the priesthood and all the things that were happening, we're going to read that here in a second, was all just a copy of what is happening in heavenly places. But the shadow is of things that are to come. You see, copies represent something that already is in existence. Shadows is a preview of that which is to come. If you've ever seen a shadow show up over your shoulder, and especially if you're a child, my first thought was always, Dad's home. Because he would often walk in, typically in my room, most likely because I got sent there for getting in trouble with my brother. And when the shadow would walk by, we would all go, uh-oh, someone's coming. And then in this New Testament passage, we see this very premise of there is the copy of the old. There is a copy in what is happening here, but there is a shadow of things to come. And that shadow is something beautiful. So let's look we are in Hebrews 7, and we have to go back to the beginning, and we're going to read together starting in verse 1, because we need to catch what's about to happen and how this is leading up to this. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descendants from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of them whom is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath. For those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily for his own sins and for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which comes later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Now, the point in what we are saying is this. So we read all of that, and now he's going to give you the summary. We have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy, a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So we read this whole entire passage, and it's important for us to note the context of what's being said. Here you have the writer of Hebrews hearkening back to the old things, setting forth why the order of the priesthood was set forth to begin with, why there was a need for it in some ways. But then he turns around and says, but the whole point of it, it's just a copy of that which was happening in heaven. It's just a copy until the one and only were to come. And when he came, he's referencing, he says, we know this to be who? Jesus. And when he came, the great high priest, he took all of these things and brought us something better. Instead of all of these sacrifices that have to be done over and over and over and over again, and the reason they have to be done is because they had to go before the Father. Now, not anymore in that way. There is one offering once and for all. You see, when you know the real thing, the copy looks like a copy. When somebody sends me a photo of a soccer game and they're like, have you seen this? And I look at it and I'm like, yes, but this is just a photo. This is not the real thing. If somebody were to send me a photo of Michelangelo's statues, I would look at it and go, this is beautiful, but this is not the real thing. This is not the real thing. When you know what the real thing looks like, copies are very evident to see. and the shadow of things to come. You see, there's a lot of wordplay with shadow. Shadows is also this aspect where he's saying there was a shadow from the ancient time that was prevailing, hearkening forth the coming of the one who would be the eternal priest. The one who is still alive, making intercession every single day, making intercession for us all before the Father. You see, he's not a dead offering, he is alive. And his being alive, he stands at the right hand of God, making intercession for us all. The beautiful, righteous, only high priest. You see, he's not a copy. And not only did he come and the shadow hearken back to his presence coming, but the shadow also continues forward. For he will return. He will come back. How do we know this? In fact, if you'll turn with me, we'll look to Matthew 25, because I want you to see a connecting point here, because Jesus himself looks at these different aspects, and especially when it comes to the end times and the final judgment. I want you to look at something starting in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. So if you go back to Hebrews specifically has Jesus sitting where? The right hand of God and the majesty of God and the throne room of God. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Now, I want to stop there real quick, because I don't want to give you the impression that the copies, while they are not the exact thing that we were hoping for in the end, the copies, the lives we live in this world to represent Jesus to a lost and dying world matter. The priesthood mattered. The priesthood and what they did mattered for the day and the life that they lived in. Today, look here, because he's specifically laying forth the items of which we, as the copies, as the individuals who live out our lives each and every day, representing Jesus to a lost and dying world, sharing the good news, we go through not the motions, but the real life aspect of living out the calling that is to be a Christian. In the same way that the priesthood was called to do specific things, to live out the real life actions of being a follower of God, we do the same. How do we know that? Because he says, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty or give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I say to you, as you did to one of the least of these my brothers, you did it to me." You see this concept of the old and the new, of that which is about to come and that which has already happened. It's hard for us as people that live on a linear timeline to realize that so much of Scripture has happened, but some is yet to come. That there is a shadow both from the Old Testament to these very specific moments in the New, but there's also shadows from the Old Testament and the New Testament to things that are to come, because we believe that Jesus will return again, do we not? And when he comes, he will come in judgment and in glory. And it is but a shadow of things to come. And when that time comes, he will look out on the people, and he will separate the sheep and his goats. And he will ask the righteous, he'll say, "Here's how I know. Here's what I know." And how we live our lives, how we obey his commands, how we do this. We are copies in this world of, a reflection of, the love that is given to us is what we are called to give to others. The grace that we are called to, that has been given to us, is what we give to others. Copies and shadows, constantly balancing the narrative from the beginning to end. You see, the hard part about at times serving a God who exists outside of time is that some things we just do not understand. My hope is that Jesus will return very soon. Amen? I don't know about you, but in this world there are some tough days. On the other hand, should he not return soon, we are to live this life as the royal priesthood that he has set forth in this world. He is the high priest, having made the ultimate sacrifice, and we living under his new law of grace and of mercy, taking care of the poor, the weak, the needy, sharing about his loving grace and kindness, that we may be representatives, saints in this world. In fact, what a beautiful world it would be if people knew our congregation as, that's the people who love others. That's the congregation that feeds the poor. It takes care of the needy. It clothes the homeless. It does those things. Why? Because they love and want to serve God. Because they are awaiting his return. Now, I don't know where you are spiritually. You may not be a believer yet, and so these things you may fall outside of. In fact, if you were to read the continuation of Matthew, you would find that those who were not with God, who had not just not done those things, but who had not obeyed God by dying to themselves through the waters of baptism, they sit outside of God. And it's nothing but tragedy. It's nothing but horrors. I do not say this to scare you. I say this because it's true. And the truth sometimes hurts. But we have a great high priest who has come. And he loves you enough to have died on the cross, and he offers intercessions should you accept it by dying to yourself in the waters of baptism. That's the offer to you tonight. It's the offer to you every day. Wherever you may be, will you come as together we stand and as we sing?